stamping and crafting friends. Welcome to Melissa's Crafting Treehouse. Today I've got a bookbinding fun fold card for you. We'll be using the Quiet Meadow Stamp Set for today's project. Now this set has a coordinating set of dies, but we'll just be using the stamp set for today's project. This is also one of my club and free card kit projects, so you can get the pieces and parts to make this project with a qualifying order. For details about my free card kit program, make sure to check out the link in the video description below. To get started, we're going to first work on the focal piece. Now this is somewhat of a vintage collage sort of look, which means there's going to be multiple layers of stamping as well as sponging, and then we'll be doing some distressing at the end. We're going to start with stamping the main focal element with this large tall flower in the stamp set. I'm using my jet black StazOn, and I especially love the jet black StazOn because it gives you a really dark black image. Some blacks will give you sort of a grayish black image, but this is really nice and crisp. So I'm going to stamp the first one in the center, the second one off to the right and low down, and I'm going to stamp the last one a little bit lower down and on the left-hand side. I like to vary the heights of the flowers just to give it more of a natural look. Next I'm going to grab the two little flowers in this stamp set. One is a tiny bit bigger than the other one, and I'm going to stamp them in 3 different spots. So I have 3 flowers total, and for these ones I'm going to stamp them off because I want them to be a little bit lighter than the main floral images. So here I'm stamping the larger of the 2 flowers. Now I've turned my block over because I've got both small flowers on the same acrylic block. And now I'm stamping the smaller of the 2 flowers, one in the lower right hand corner and one down towards the left. Next I've got my larger flower in the stamp set, and again I'm going to stamp that in second inking. So I'm stamping off that first layer of ink, and then I'm going to stamp the same image in the upper right off there on the left, and then another one up and towards the left at the top. Now I don't want them to be exactly evenly spaced to help it look more natural. Next I'm bringing in my text image that's in the set, and these letters are typed. There's some garden themed words, but it's sort of worn looking, which is just going to add to the vintage kind of look and the collage effect on this focal piece. For this image I'm going to be using my Sahara sand, so I'm switching from my black to some of my brown colors now, and this is just going to allow the colors to be different tones and a little bit lighter than the black that I have in there now, which just adds some more dimension and depth to the collage. Now so far I haven't overlapped any of my images, but with this text image I am going to do some overlapping, and I'm going to be using that in first and second inking. Again, just adding more depth and kind of texture to the piece. And as I stamp this image, I am again making sure that I'm stamping different amounts of it so that there's some variation in where those images are and that it looks sort of regularly irregular, if you will. So the next image I'm going to work with is the Specs image that's in the set, and for this one I'm going to be using my soft suede. The Specs are really a subtle addition to the piece, and I'm doing them now in first inking, mostly around the edges to kind of fill in some spaces that look a little bit open, but of course it also overlaps some of the images as well that are already there. So now I'm coming in with second, third, even fourth inking of those Specs, which adds more texture and dimension to the piece even more. So the next thing I'm going to do is start adding some color to the edges of my piece. I'm starting with my Sahara sand and my blending brush, and I'm starting off the page, and that just helps to make sure that I don't get a big splotch of color when my blending brush has a lot of ink on it at first. And now I have a blending brush to use with my soft suede, and I'm going to do the same thing, starting off the page and just adding some soft suede to some select spots here and there. Adding these browns gives it somewhat of a vintage look. And now I'm going to use that same blending brush to apply a little bit of the early espresso ink. And I'm going to use the espresso sparingly just to provide some contrast and some additional highs and lows in the shading of my browns. Now when you're working with darker colors, it's that much more important that you start off the page, because as you could see there, the first color that came off of my blending brush was really dark and kind of splotchy. So you can see that spot I'm pointing to right there. That's a spot where I got a lot more ink than I really wanted to, because I didn't rub it off on my scratch paper first. So I'm coming in with my Sahara sand over that spot to blend it a little bit and soften the edges of that sort of dark area that feels too dark to me. Now to add to the vintage distressed look, I'm going to use my paper snips to rough up the edges of my focal piece. You can really use any scissors, but the paper snips have a really sharp, nice blade. If you use your paper snips or any scissors, just be extra careful so you don't cut yourself. And this is somewhat messy because I'm basically shaving off some of the edge and creating sort of flecks of paper that are getting on my work surface. So you'll want to do it over your table and not necessarily over your lap, because you'll make a mess in your lap otherwise. And when I get to the corners, I typically need to hold the cardstock pretty tightly in my fingers just to be able to effectively distress those corners. And then you may just want to clean up your work surface before you move on to the next step. And last but not least, I'm going to curl up the corners of my piece just with my fingertips, just to add that little additional distressed look. And I'm doing the opposite corners curled in, and then the remaining two corners curled out. To get started with the assembly of the body of this card, I'm going to first burnish on my score lines. This is scored at 4 1/4 and 5 1/2. And then I'm going to open up the body and just put some adhesive. In this case, I'm using my multi-purpose liquid glue to seal the binding portion of the card. Now for this card, I stamped on the inside, and typically when I stamp on the inside of a card, I like to do my images stamped off so it's subtle and kind of looks a little bit in the background. And I, of course, want to leave enough room to be able to write on the inside of the card as well. So I've inked up that large flower image, stamped it off, and I stamped it a little bit off the edge, which has a nice natural look to it. And now I've stamped that little flower again, also stamped off in the upper right hand corner, and I did one of the larger of the two flowers and two of the smaller ones. Now I'm using that typography type image again, stamping with my Sahara sand. I don't want it to be too dark so it doesn't overshadow that stamped off flower image. And now again I'm going to use my blending brush to give the edges a bit of a vintage look to mirror the look on the outside. And then I'm just going to go ahead and attach my inside piece to a layer of black cardstock. And this will mirror what we're going to do on the front of the card, because the focal piece on the front will also be backed with a piece of black. So now I'm just going to assemble that front focal piece by attaching it to its black layer. And then I'm going to go ahead and attach that layer to the front of my card. Now I've got a few pieces for the binding of my book binding card. Now on my first card I used that fabric looking pattern facing out, and for this version I'm going to use the wood grain pattern. So I'm attaching it to a black backing, again to mirror the look of the focal piece, and then I'll go ahead and attach that to the binding of the card. Next I'm going to use my Bronze Blends alcohol marker to color one of my ribbons that I'm going to use on the binding of the card. So I've got my metallic mesh ribbon, and it comes of course looking silver, so I wanted to kind of antique it a little bit, give it a little bit more of a bronze-ish, goldish look, so that it would blend better with the brown tones in the card. So I'm using the edge of my alcohol marker. You definitely want to use the edge, otherwise you fray the tip of the marker. So I'm cutting off about 3 inches of these 3 ribbons, and I'm using the fine art ribbon, which has gold flecks in it, and I'm using the gold shimmer ribbon, and then of course the metallic mesh with the bronze color added to it. And now I've got a piece of linen thread. I'm just tying it around the middle of the 3 ribbons, and I'm using a binder clip to kind of hold them in the middle, and that just kind of holds them in place so they're a little bit less precarious and have a little bit of weight to them, so it's a little bit easier to tie that linen ribbon around the center. And then I'll just trim off the ends at an angle to add more of a finished look to this ribbon element. And now I'm snipping off some of the metallic mesh since it's sticking out a little far, and I'm kind of cutting that at a point instead of at an angle like the other 2 ribbons. And now I'm just snipping off the ends of the linen ribbon, and I've finished making my little ribbon embellishment. And I'm going to use glue dots to attach my embellishment to the side of my card. You could also use some multi-purpose liquid glue as well. Now for my card I added some champagne rhinestone jewels. Card kits will not include the champagne rhinestone jewels, but you can use some basic rhinestones with the Blends alcohol marker to get a very similar look if you have rhinestones on hand and you want to use those on your card. And for my card I used one of the medium-sized rhinestone jewels and 2 of the smaller ones. Now I did also add some Wink of Stella to the flowers on my card, and here are the 2 finished versions of my card. I hope you've enjoyed seeing this card, and we'll have a blast making your own. As a reminder, this is a club and free card kit project. To get free card kits, all you have to do is place a qualifying order in my online store. Plus, first-time customers get all 3 kits regardless of the order size. To learn more about how you can get free card kits, check out the link in the video description below. I hope you enjoyed my project today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with friends, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for spending some time with me today, and happy crafting!